We are fortunate, I guess, to have Bob Thornton and Jim Paradis to lead us in what the discussion we're calling is Closing the Divide, a spirituality of unity and harmony in the time of anger and division. So that's a big one. So I'm going to just turn it over to the two of them and let them run with it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack. We were grateful, Jack, that you gave us the easiest topic of the series.
Yeah, right. Well,
to reflect on.
right.
But
Well, that's because I have great confidence in you.
we're delighted to be
Yeah.
with you. And just to give you a little quick overview of what we'd like to do in a moment, we'd like to have people, and Lacey will facilitate this, kind of randomly put folks into breakout rooms. And we'll have a couple of questions we'd like you to address. What we do want to share is that if anyone's uncomfortable with that or would prefer not to participate in the breakout rooms, which will be for about 10 minutes, just don't go in if you have the option of okay or not okay to go in, or if you're just placed and you find yourself there, just turn your mic and your video off, and there's no pressure on participating in that aspect of the evening. So we'll do that in a moment, and then we're going to take a look at some of the dimensions of a spirituality of unity and harmony in the face of anger and division, polarization, which we've all been experiencing on multiple levels simultaneously for some years now. And so we'll unpack a few of those. We've kind of divided them a bit into what we're calling some inner work that we think would be helpful to think about, as well as interpersonal work. Obviously, there'll be some overlap over those two categories, but we've kind of divided it up a bit in that way. Jim, anything else you might want to add before we pose the breakout room questions?
Just to say that it's great to be with all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces, and some for me are new faces, but thank you for giving us your time tonight and joining.
Amen to that. So again, Lacey will put us randomly into some breakout rooms in a moment. And there's a couple of questions we'd like you to reflect on and share about. The reason we thought this might be helpful is to start, particularly, is that it's an opportunity for us to hear from one another how it is that we have been impacted by the anger, the division, the polarization that we've all been experiencing. How's it impacting you on any or all levels, cognitively, physically, emotionally, interpersonally, and so on? So we ask you to spend a little bit of time reflecting and sharing on that question. And the second question is, how have you responded? What do you do to cope? What do you find yourself doing to find peace, unity, harmony within yourself or in your relationships that may be conflicted around some of the issues that we've been facing as a culture and as a world? So those are the two questions. We'd like to just take about 10 minutes. And Lacey, do your magic with putting folks in some breakout rooms, and we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. And then ask anyone who would like to share what your thoughts were.
Are we all back?
Yes.
I think so.
Yes.
Could I invite us, because we neglected to call the group to a prayerful silence as we begin, maybe right now, before we share the responses to those questions, we could take a pregnant pause of silence. Take a deep breath and just spend this time in reflection. Amen.
So we just want to open things up at this point to spend a few minutes inviting anyone who might like to share either your own thoughts on the two questions of how you've been impacted by the anger, division, polarization, and so on, as well as how you've coped with it and how you've perhaps responded to it. So we just open that up for anyone to share anything you'd like.
Should people raise their hands? There's a thing that you can raise a hand, I think, somewhere.
Yeah. Or you could just jump in.
Well, I'll jump in. We had a very good dialogue and they were nice small groups, so I'm appreciative of that. And it was interesting, the variety of perspectives that people had, whether it was the COVID situation, whether it's political environment, whether it's the Ukraine situation. There's so many elements out there that cause conflict and consternation. And it'll be interesting how the entire group, I'm sure everyone's coming from a separate angle, but some of the elements that we discussed, I think, which are helpful to me and I try to reinforce every day is as you interact with others around these topics is to slow down, pause your immediate reactions, listen more, and seek to understand the other person's perspective before just reacting. That was a discussion point that we had, that people today immediately jump to share their reaction, to express their anger, to share their viewpoints, rather than sitting back and listening a little bit more. So that was sort of the emotional reaction that our breakout team discussed.
Terrific, thank you. Other thoughts?
I'm June Ruth, the one that has a picture instead of of me. I'm up in Massachusetts with the St. Augustine's in Andover, Massachusetts. So 6 years now as of Easter Vigil, a Catholic. The word that kept coming up for me is patience, that it requires of me a lot of patience to deal with the diversity of differences of opinion that exist in this country, without even going as far as how incredibly unfathomable it is to see the suffering of Ukraine, to me, or Yemen or Syria or any of those places, and to imagine that humans would do this to other humans. But in the more, down local things, people have differences of opinion about many things. And in the listening part that the gentleman just said is very important, and patience, because, it requires, my goodness, it requires a lot of patience sometimes to hear the views of people who are so in opposition to one's own thoughts. And yeah, so that's it, patience.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I would speak for a minute. We had a nice group of people. We're in different places, commenting about different things that were upsetting. Jose from Philippines was giving us a kind of a view of what's going on in the Philippines between the church and the politics. So we think it's just like within ourselves, within our small community, within our experience of church and life. But I think that for me, it's journey, and it's understanding where am I in the journey and moving on and through through the pain, through the suffering, through the divisions, through the hurt that we've been through, and then moving on and finding places where we feel safe and where we feel that God is present. And so that's me.
Thank you. We have some time for a few more comments or observations. If anyone else would like to share your thoughts or your experience in the breakout group.
I have a thought. Last month at Sister Bernadette's half-a-day retreat, she brought up a question about spring and what is springing within us. And we ended up talking about how collectively we were praying for, the church to be healed, for politics to be healed, for people to see our way of thinking. And then we ended up by saying, but there's just as many people praying that we get on their page, that we are the problem as a liberal. And that was, that brought up a really like aha moment for us, because we were saying, well, whether it be, love for the LGBT within the in the church, or people living with HIV within the church, or people that are different than us for whatever reason, and hoping for healing, there are just as many people praying that for the opposite, like, and that was sad for me and disturbing for me, but it is the truth of, difference.
Thank you. I think Charles had his hand up.
I'm Charles Thorne. I'm secular. I'm not a clerical person. I'm out of Gainesville, Virginia, not Florida. And my observation would be that this polarization and this partisan politics and the divide and the anger certainly began, at least what my understanding is, before COVID, quite a ways before, but I feel like it's been exacerbated by COVID. And I find it among my students, they can't even talk to each other. They either yell or they just don't talk. They have their heads down and they're playing on their phones. They're gaming in the classroom. And then when they do talk, they can't even figure out how to do that anymore. So I think that's been lost. And I think that being alone, social norms and cues have been lost. And I think it exacerbates for me my own problems with rumination and OCPD issues and all that, of just obsessing over all these things that are so negative. So it's, and I don't really have an answer. I know one thing is I can't detach from the phone and the bad news. I try to pick up a book and within 30 seconds, I'm down looking at my phone again. So I've kind of lost what is a book. And, my phone is caught. I can't go anywhere without it. God forbid it doesn't work. So yeah, I guess my thought is, I don't know where it started. It feels like a snowball effect, as I shared in our group, that began before COVID, exacerbated from COVID. And we're here, and I don't know when it ends. I'm thinking, doesn't it end at some point? Because it's not the same world that I remember when I was much younger. So so I think it's impacted me. I think it began before. It's worse. The isolation, we've got more angry. People are more angry. That's my sense. And don't have an answer, except one thing I know is to stop at the phone, but those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
I don't know how to put my hand up.
Please just jump in, Trish.
Okay. One of the things I find is that I gain perspective knowing that my parents lived through the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War. They lived in Africa for a while. They came back. They lived in Northern Ireland when there was war. But there's always a lot of goodness everywhere in people. And you don't have to tolerate the idea that somebody who is utterly destructive and evil is good. But even when destructive evil people are causing great treachery and heartache, there's so many good people in the world always, and never forgetting that, feeling it every day. I mean, just today, the lady who is the mail person on my street was delivering mail to everybody in the pouring rain. And she said, "Hi, Tricia, how are you doing?" I said, "Do you need anything? Do you want a cup of tea or anything?" She said, "No, I'm fine." I said, "But you're working so hard." She said, "Oh, it's okay." And I think there are so many people whose daily life is heroic and wonderful and stable and strong. And that's what keeps me going.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Who
Yeah.
has heard, and to everyone for participating in some way in some of the previous discussion. We'd like to move at this point to taking a look at some dimensions of a spirituality of unity and harmony in the context of the real world issues that we're dealing with. And again, we've kind of divided these up into some inner work and interpersonal work. And Jim is going to share some thoughts about some of the ideas that we have about the inner work we can do to learn to respond effectively to the disharmony, the dis-ease that we experience.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks for your reflections in the breakout group. And to be quite honest, I think they overlap with many things that we would like to share with you tonight. And one thing that is coming immediately to mind, listening to just for a few moments to everyone, is how complex a topic this is and how complicated our emotions are. And the anger, the fear, the division, the pain, the grief, the confusion. I could go on, I guess. But at the same time, they beg the question, when something is wrong, what do we need to do? And how can we reach out? Or in what I would like to share with you is, how can we reach in and draw on our inner work, inner directed living as a way of our relating and our outer response. Just to share a few thoughts on holding tensions. The spiritual writer that you're all aware of, I'm sure, Father Ron Rolheiser, he says that given the complex and conflicted world in which we currently live, we need to, quote, carry our tensions at a high level in order to live a deep and mature spirituality as people of faith. In other words, not simply living out of our reactive mode, the reactive self, but recovering a deeper sense of who we are as in our deepest self in God. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there to somehow do the work of interior work that we can slow down, as someone said in one of the breakout groups, and draw on a deeper well. One of the practical ways of, or some practical ways rather, of facing these emotions and conflicts, and that it sounds simplistic to say it, but even those few moments of silence are a reminder that we do have the possibility of breathing in a deep way, which induces a relaxation response and activates our parasympathetic nervous system, to respond in a relaxing way or versus the flight stress response that we automatically carry. And how the practice of breathing, which is can be taught, reduces or helps to reduce the threat in the face of conflicts and tensions. There's also, as you heard, read about, I'm sure, the practices of mindfulness. There are many different skills in that practice, many different techniques you can draw on, but for our purposes here, it means a focused, non-judgmental awareness of our experience and what we observe in others, trying to take note of our experiences, naming them, having curiosity about them without having to act on them. There is the understanding of looking at our experiences and uncomfortable tensions as restlessness, as an inner restlessness that Augustine speaks of in that his most famous prayer "You have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Well, this is our spirituality. And our deepest longing and seeking finds its rest in God. And to be aware of that and to honor that as we're facing different difficulties is a great treasure and a prayer. Also, thinking in a practical way of when we're facing tensions and conflicts, not to be isolated and necessarily avoid it, but to find a time of solitude for the purpose of reordering our desires, our deepest self, in other words, without feeling that I have to automatically react, but to find a time to have solitude and listen. And finally, to remind ourselves of, I've really appreciated the response about never forgetting the goodness of people. To not forget the goodness of what we have within ourselves as we find conflict and tension, and to find a resiliency and a rootedness of ourself in God as we're struggling with complex things that are going on. Let me leave us at that point right now, and we'll turn it back over to Bob, who will be bringing us into some of the interpersonal work we'd like to share with you.
Thanks, Jim. Jim had come across a great quote from a Dominican friar, Timothy Radcliffe. And the question he posed was, how can we listen to our opponents, even obnoxious ones? It kind of hits right to what I think many of us encounter on a regular basis, potentially, in these recent years of heightened conflict and disunity. And how do we deal with and enter into interpersonal spaces with people who hold vastly different beliefs, which may be expressed with utter certitude and even aggression at times? So how can we hold that kind of space in encountering other people? First piece we'd like to spend a few minutes looking at is mutuality and empathy as realities, but with regard to empathy, particularly a key skill set in enabling us to enter into these kinds of spaces. And our own John Shea, an Augustinian, who is a pastoral counselor, has written extensively on topics such as finding God again, kind of dealing with the superego God, and how do we appropriate an adult spirituality. His most recent work is entitled Adulthood, Morality, and the Fully Human, a Mosaic of Peace. I would highly recommend this book. It's not an easy read. It's quite dense, but it's packed with, I think, important notions for the very issues that we're discussing tonight and that we're all facing on a regular basis. And in that, he writes about the self in mutuality, hyphenated. In other words, we cannot think of a self for any of us without understanding that in the context of mutuality. That is to say, in early human development and throughout adult development, our sense of self, our identities, do not develop in isolation. They necessarily develop in interpersonal contexts. So there are individual lines of development that will occur in both of those phases, but there's at the same time a mutuality, that it's relational in how we actually develop an identity. And he writes, mutuality lies then at the heart of human development. And what makes mutuality possible is empathy. Goes on to quote Judith Jordan, who is a feminist developmental theorist and psychotherapist, who says of empathy, when one feels empathy for the other person, it provides a palpable sense that one influences and emotionally touches the other person. In empathy, I am present, vulnerable, open, responsive, and concerned. Goes on to say, empathy is the way, italicized, the way of mutuality. It might be fair to imagine that this is a little bit ideal. And while those are developmental realities, that we are this self in mutuality as we move through the human developmental process, we're also finding ourselves in these rather conflicted situations, very often polarized situations, and so on and so forth. So it might be fair to say, how do you enter mutuality with an other who isn't open to it, who is not assuming that same posture, who's not meeting me in an empathic connection? And John addresses this issue and says, a mutually empathic relationship is self and other initiating and responding together. That would be the ideal. The fullness of mature relating may be fervently wished for, but it is always a dance. In adulthood, loving care and justice allow us to do our part, whether or not the other is able to respond. I think it's fair to look at that statement as one that requires a lot of courage, but doesn't leave us helpless either. It's really a challenge to embrace adult relating, so that even if we're not sure that another person whom we're encountering, who may be coming from a different place and not open necessarily to an empathic connection, that it really challenges us to embrace our adulthood, embrace interpersonal style, whether or not the person is going to respond in kind. So it's really a challenge to all of us to embrace an adult spirituality, in effect, and an adult style of interrelating, particularly in conflict. And, as Charles had said earlier, it's not like conflict never existed before COVID. It's not that we all haven't had to deal with conflicted situations, conflicted relationships, and so on. But given the rather global dimensions of this, and certainly heightened tensions and disunity within our own culture, I think it's helpful to kind of remind ourselves that we are adults, and assuming that we can learn a tolerance for situations where somebody isn't meeting us where we're coming from. Adults can do this. Not easy, but it's possible. So again, we're hardwired to be mutual. It's the nature of human development. So we are selves in mutuality always. There is no separating the self out, in effect, from the notion of interrelatedness or mutuality with an other. Second thing in terms of interpersonal work that we felt was an important posture, certainly value, but also a skill set, and that is humility. I think many of you are familiar with this passage, but I'll repeat it for the purposes of this conversation. Augustine said, "If you should ask me, what are the ways of God? The ways of God." Just think about that phrase for a moment. If you should ask me, what are the ways of God? I would tell you that the first is humility, the second is humility, and the third is humility. Not that there are no other precepts to give, but if humility does not precede all that we do, our efforts are fruitless. That's a powerful statement. It's a powerful endorsement of the importance of humility. So that our efforts are fruitless if humility does not precede that. We felt, given Augustine's posture and position on that, it would be important for us to spend a little bit of time on that. It's also a set of skills. It's not simply a value or a posture, but there are things underneath humility and within humility that we'd like to unpack just for a moment. So, given this discussion, humility can include pulling back, and others have referred to this. So again, we're seeing a lot of overlap, I think, in our thinking on this, pulling back and becoming better acquainted with ourselves. Jim and I are both mental health practitioners, and one notion about psychotherapy, one way of understanding what psychotherapy is, it's a process of introducing people to themselves. And humility invites us to sort of do that within ourselves. Can I get better acquainted with myself? Which sometimes includes encountering dimensions of ourselves that might be less than comfortable, or might be less than what we would see as our ideal selves. And humility really calls us to that kind of exploration, that self-exploration. So that really is inner work too. Again, you'll see some overlap between the inner and interpersonal dimensions that we're discussing this evening. Being curious about another person and the context of that person's life, their beliefs, their perspectives. We just don't know so much about each other. I think we can use that in sort of mundane day in, day out ways to stop cutting somebody off on the highway or whatever, because I don't know what that person's day has been like, or if I got cut off and I'm angry and I want to kind of respond in some angry way, it's worth thinking for a moment, what's that person's life like today? What might that person be encountering and facing? I don't know, but it might be something horrible. And to presume and assume that another has a whole lot more going on in her life or his life than I could possibly know is a reasonable posture, and it kind of calls to that curiosity. Can I be curious in an encounter about what is this person coming from and out of? What context did this person grow up in? What's this person dealing with in his or her current life? So curiosity about other people we see as a dimension of humility. Engaging in the discipline of active empathic listening, and again, that has been referred to earlier, I think, from some of the small group discussions. But what does that mean? You know, what do we mean by active listening or empathic listening? really trying to put ourselves in another person's shoes, which means we have to step out of our own for a minute and try to imagine what is this person's experience, again, maybe in an encounter where there's contention and difference, strong difference of opinion. Can I try to put myself in that other person's shoes, even for a moment? In actual communication, allowing what the other person is saying to actually enter my awareness, resisting, say a knee-jerk defensive response, interrupting someone, for example, reactivity, or what I think is fairly common in most people's experience, formulating your response while you're still kind of listening to what the other person is saying. I think we tend to do that automatically. So active and empathic listening kind of calls us to a different sort of discipline where I have to empty my mind of what I might be thinking about saying in response to this person, at least for a little while, and actually be present and listen and let what that person is saying enter me for a few moments. That's what we mean by empathic listening. Letting go of control. It's very tempting for us to want to win in a conversation that can be contentious or where there's great differences. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction for a lot of us. And so that requires us to let go of control. So if I'm letting go of control on a conversation, I don't know where it's going to go. And I can't predetermine the outcome. I have to actually sit with that kind of unease, say, this isn't about me controlling the outcome. This is about me being present to the moment and actually listening to that person. Growing more comfortable with the unfinished, the unconcluded, the unresolved in encounters with others. Oftentimes, in a conversation, even a contentious one, you kind of want to wrap it up. You want to bring it home somehow or other, to conclude it in some way that feels like there's a cap on it and some answers perhaps to something. Very often in angry, divisive, diseased encounters, we have to get comfortable with the fact that we're not going to wrap that up in that conversation or in that discussion. Lots is going to be unfinished, lots going to be unconcluded, unresolved. And can we kind of challenge ourselves to stretch in a way that allows us to leave it alone when it's time to leave it alone, even if it's not concluded, even if I haven't convinced another of my perspective or opinion. Hopefully there's been mutual listening, but we don't have to wrap it up. And that takes some discipline too, to be able to let go of that. Finally, at least in the context of the skills of humility in communication, particularly to be able to share our experiences of contentious issues, not our positions on them. People are always interested in hearing each other's experiences because they're often, hopefully, usually honest. And we're always interested in hearing honest, truthful statements from each other. They're compelling. So if we can focus on our experience rather than this is my position on this issue or that issue or that issue, whatever it might be, we're probably more likely to be heard and probably more likely to hear the other if the other can join us in sharing those experiences. So there are a few of the skills involved in the value and posture of humility, which we think is a necessary component to a spirituality of unity and harmony. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Bob. One other dimension that we would feel is an essential component of the spirituality of unity and harmony would be living in a posture of forgiveness and reconciliation. When I use the word reconciliation, I'm generally saying being brought back together in oneness. And in any spirituality that we have, forgiveness must be in play. It's central to the gospel. And it's something that we're called to consider as Christians. And also it's a step of courage, I think. Someone said that before, Bob might have mentioned that. A letting go of the need to retaliate, to hold on to resentments and hateful thoughts. Forgiveness, I think most people would say, is not so much an event, but a process, a series, an experience of a series of moments, and sometimes a slow process. It's something that can be directed to ourselves and to others as a gift. In thinking about this and a lot of the conflicts and the situations, the polarization, the pain that so many people are in, I was wondering what would happen if we, as a community of faith, were to consider a different kind of communal penance experience beyond the individualized notion that we often celebrate. Not a formal sacrament so much, but a sacramental experience where we could offer a space of bringing couples or families or warring factions, herding parties of some sort together in a place where something might happen, a happening of grace, we might say, to establish a contemplative atmosphere where listening can happen, and the possibility of an openness to healing might be engaged. In the silence in which we gather, could these parties, whether it was couples or groups or families, leaders, different factions, could we sit with the unease that we have and the pain, possibly the grief that is there? I think of the loss of family connections, and encounter, going back to what Bob was reflecting, in humility, encountering our defensiveness and our own wounds with an influence of the Spirit's presence. Maybe, again, going back to the importance of humility, we might encounter our own complicity in a division that's taking place, in an alienation that's out there, in our judgmentalism, maybe our refusals to be aware of ourselves and other relationships in our world where we've been part of the pain and part of the problem and not part of the healing. This might be a space where we could allow issues and feelings to remain, again, undone, incomplete, unfinished. This isn't a ritual of fixing, but an openness to a happening of grace that might happen. I'm reminded by I don't know what the exact quote is, but I remember he said it in a talk on reconciliation. Richard Rohr, the spiritual writer, he said, every time we seek to forgive, we intend to forgive, we hope to be able to forgive, we are reconciled bit by bit through God's love. We're moving toward something that is of God's love. And sometimes the most important thing is the movement. That's the movement, that's something we moving toward reconciliation. Even if it isn't complete forgiveness, it's a step toward understanding. I think of it, that it might be an opportunity where Christ, as in the Gospels, calms the storm in some way. Those are some thoughts about forgiveness and reconciliation. That's complex too. It's a complex dimension within and a practice that any of us have, as it requires a lot of courage. A few thoughts to conclude our reflection tonight. That the things we've spoken about in this reflection on spirituality of unity and harmony this is difficult work. Whether it's inner work, interpersonal work, outer work, it's demanding. And it requires intention, commitment to make something new happen. Where we see that wrong and brokenness takes place. Bob, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I think it also circles back to the notion of vulnerability, empathy, which includes the need to be vulnerable, which also means that if we're attempting to reconcile within ourselves, perhaps, or to engage in dialogue with others who are very different and hold different perspectives, the vulnerability means, we're going to fail. We're going to misfire. We're going to not get it at times. We're going to have to let go of our assumptions, the things unconsciously we assume are the case, because they may not be, and they may not be for everyone else. To be able to come to a sort of new place, even create a new place within ourselves, where that vulnerability becomes possible, where it's okay for us to screw up, it's okay for us to make mistakes, it's okay for us to be in a posture of learning and not knowing all the time. And that can be a little unfamiliar sometimes to adults. So some of this points to the possibility of a new space within ourselves, within which we can encounter the dis-ease, the division, the anger that we're encountering every day in our lives. We're mindful of our time, but would be happy to take some time if anyone had comments or questions that you might like to share in response to any of the material that we shared earlier. So if it's okay, Jack,
Yeah, very good.
time-wise, to allow for some
Sure.
comments.
I think it gives people an opportunity to ask a question or look for clarification.
Sure.
So if you got something out there you want to ask or clarify, go ahead.
I would like the name of the book.
Sure. The book is called Adulthood, Morality, and the Fully Human, a Mosaic of Peace. Apropos of that, Lacey is able, when she communicates after tonight's session, to include some of our notes that also would include references to the things, that books or other writings or writers that we referred to. So you'll be able to get that in writing as well.
Thank you.
Sure. It's well worth the read, and it's well worth the. I actually believe it presents a blueprint to some degree the timing of which is perfect for the very. So I'd highly recommend it.
And thank you for sharing those skills and some of the examples that go along with those skills. They are challenging, obviously. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of role models today exhibiting those skills and traits that you talk about. You know, whether the fellow who was the teacher down south talked about social media and kids checking their phones and TV and all that. There's just not that many examples. You have to go back to, I guess, scripture, and that's the ultimate example and base. But living examples today, there aren't many for people to learn and grow from.
You're absolutely right. And I think what this calls us all to as adults is to become those examples. But we can be those examples in the worlds in which we inhabit. So I think you're right. It's hard to maybe point to people who are assuming these kinds of postures, but we can.
And I'm sorry, I was referring to more public figures than our own example.
Sure. Thank you.
Bob and Jim, it's Paul. Thank you so much. I mean, all of these things are incredible to help me plumb deeper into the complex reality of just listening to somebody who's different, or let alone maybe an opponent. And I loved your bringing John Shea's work into it. I'll have to get that book myself. But one element I want to just bring up, just because it has occurred to me in the last month of the crisis in Ukraine, and the powerlessness I and probably all of us feel around that, even the anger and the explicit division of bombs falling on your city from neighbors. Here's what I wound up doing more recently out of my own powerlessness. Offering my day up, everything I'm doing for Ukraine, you know, I might say, and Russia, you know, the peoples of those countries. And here's one explicit thing that in terms of prayer, I mean, honestly, I sometimes wonder, like, where is God with all of this? Like, where are you, God? Sort of like the people in Dachau might cry out. And certainly the people of Ukraine might say that. When we're doing something here, like in the house, we say prayers in the morning. There's a psalm. Here's just a psalm from this week. And I imagine myself with those people in Ukraine saying this psalm to God. I'll just read one little paragraph of it. O Lord, hear my prayer and let my cry come to you. Hide not your face from me in the day of my distress. That's enough. And the point is, maybe everything we do, just in the specifics of the division, horror, fear, and anger raised by the Ukrainian crisis, we can offer our day up. We can not always be averting to it, but we can have empathy, build it for both sides, if you will, at least the soldiers, and even look for and listen for how our prayers like that can be united with the Ukrainian people's prayer.
Thank you.
That's a good reflection for Holy Week, Paul.
Thanks.
Do we have anyone else who would like to speak?
Carol.
Yes, I just want to thank you for taking this on as a topic, because I thought this was just the mess in me and not really a topic. So, do you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's everywhere, and it's within us. It's without us. It's finding a place to go with all of this, and that you've helped with that. Really been very helpful. Appreciate. And I have notes in my phone. I wasn't playing on the phone. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.
All right, I think it's time to thank Jim and Bob.
Thank you.
Yeah, for a wonderful presentation. As you know, we have these, will be recorded, it is recorded, and will be available to you if you want to listen to it again, and reflect and that type of thing. So again, I want to thank the two of you. It's really been a very thought-provoking and sort of
Mm.
action seeking. What can I do? How can I be an instrument of God's peace, etc. So thank you all very much. And
Jack, pardon me for interrupting you, but
what's new?
you must. Jack and I live together, by the way.
Oh, great.
Go ahead, Bob.
We did whatever else you may have to say. We did want to conclude as we began earlier with kind of a virtual joining of hands and another moment of silence. So I'm sorry, Jack, but we'd like to do that before we say goodnight.
All right, let's do that.
So let's take a moment in a virtual joining of hands to take a moment of silence. Thank you again for your time, which is the most valuable thing most of us have, and your presence to this topic this evening, and it's been delightful for us to be with you tonight.
Thank you. I really
Thank you very
appreciate
much.
it.
Go
The
ahead,
opportunity.
Very much
Thank you.
needed.
Great.
Thank you.
God bless you. Good
What-
night.
Good night.
everybody.
Good night.
Peace,
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you again.
pleasure.
Peace both inside and outside.
Amen.
That.
Amen.
Thank you.
Great,
Good
thank
night.
you.